Uh, belongings. I understand the finds from excavations as belongings rather than artifacts. And I see the archaeological task as figuring out to whom they belong and to help restore heritage to descendants. From excavations in January 2020 in East Bradenton, it was a research team, recovered 35,000 items that spanned the Angola period and more recent materials. These belongings belong to many layers of history for this land. And we start by acknowledging that this land is the ancestral home of Seminole Miccosukee people. The research, these belongings that you see on the screen that we recovered in January 2020, is meant to heal the ruptures that separated people from their heritage. The story for Angola, in terms of a research project, starts in 2004, when Vicky Oldham organized a group of scholars to try to find something that at that point was considered just a legend, that there was a community of freedom seekers, as the original web page showed for Looking for Angola project. It laid out, was there freedom seekers living here in the area of Sarasota and Manatee? We started the project with an outreach program in 2005 that Vicky Oldham videoed and made into a documentary. And I'm going to just show you a few of the screen captures from that video. We start with Cantor Brown Jr., historian, who know they first wrote about Angola in 1990. And in 2005, 15 years later, only one journalist was interested in that story, and that was Vicky Oldham. And Cantor Brown at that point said, "I cannot express enough my appreciation for what Vicky has done and is doing for this project." Professor Rosin Howard, then of the University of Central Florida, who had been engaging in ethnographic research on Andros Island in the Bahamas among people known as Black Seminoles in Red Bays, noted that their oral histories begins with their great-grandparents leaving Florida, that they didn't know much about the lives of their ancestors in Florida, but maybe our research project will be able to connect the people of Red Bays with their ancestors' home, Angola. And a much younger looking me stated that our project took very seriously the notion that we should be engaged with both local communities and descendant communities. In an older archaeology, we would release the results of our finds. We have people involved with this from the get-go because we want this to be a story told with the people who care most about Angola. And I predicted when we find material evidence in Angola, it will be an important moment in the history of this region and of America to remember the struggles of the people who created something new in freedom. And I'm happy to report, and similar to the process throughout the research, I'm sharing with you all what we're doing as we're doing the work. And this is that moment where we have the opportunity to share this history, a history, as the title lays out, no longer silenced. 15 years ago, the history was almost unthinkable. We had others, sometimes appropriately, sometimes not so appropriately, telling us that no, there was no such place. This was not something that was possible. It never happened. And we're trying to discourage the research, but we carried forward. And I'm so excited to share the findings with you all tonight. And I'm excited because this is the best place to share our initial insights into Angola, to share this moment with you all, because we wouldn't have this history if it wasn't for Time Sifters Archaeology Society. This was the crucial relationship that allowed this project to go forward. Time Sifters was the initial financial agent for the Looking for Angola team as it was getting grants. At every step of the process, Time Sifters provided volunteers to help out in just every way imaginable, from the excavations to the lab work to hosting me and others and giving talks and just providing moral support. Throughout this 15-year period, I've written in the newsletters about this project. I gave a talk. It's now been 5 years. And all of this has been really to celebrate Time Sifters as a chapter of the Florida Anthropological Society and to really celebrate community-based archaeology. This year, the theme for Florida Archaeology Month was community-based archaeology. And this is one of the examples of working with volunteers, with community members, in order to really understand what has occurred in the past through archaeological science. That process included, and you might recognize some of the people with excavations and lab work, and there's been just so much wonderful support. Throughout the process, I've always brought in the undergraduates, the bright, motivated students of New College of Florida, and I can't be grateful enough for the interest, the mentoring, just the real support the Time Sifters volunteers have given to generations of undergraduates through this and other projects that have launched their careers in so many different ways. As I think about and reflect on that process, the term I kept on coming back to was a slender reed. I've often said we were incredibly lucky in the work that we did and the findings that I'll share with you in a few moments. But the way this played out really amazes me in ways that I do not understand, and no one's been able to tell me, including his son. Dewey Dye Jr. somehow knew that a Spanish land claim, a rejected Spanish land claim from 1828 that included the word Angola on it, was significant. That single term on one piece of paper he recognized as important. He gave a lecture at the Manatee County Historical Society in May 16th, 1973, that someone transcribed and put into the Eaton room of the Bradenton Public Library. And reading that long history for the area of Bradenton, Dewey Dye put forward there was a place of freedom on the Manatee River. Cantor Brown Jr., while working at the Tampa Bay History Center, saw more information, but really just a little bit of information on this community. He learned of its destruction in 1821. He corresponded with Dewey Dye, and in 1990 published an article and then expanded on it in the introduction to one of his books. And as I mentioned before, he was quoted as saying, Vicki Oldham, then a journalist, heard him, read the article, and decided more than 15 years ago that really there was a need to find this. And while we now have a steadfast tree supporting this research, if any of these individuals had not taken part, if they hadn't stepped forward, we wouldn't know what we know now. This is really what we knew. You can see, if you look closely, this is from 1828, when the US gained Florida from Spain. Part of the treaty required that Spanish land claims would be honored as the property rights shifted. And Caldiz asked for 640 acres, as you noted, rejected, and he just mentions Angola there, and it's mentioned again over here on the Oyster River, which we now know is the Manatee River. John Lee Williams, in the territory of Florida, includes a letter with 3 people traveling up to the Manatee River and seeing the ruins of cabins. And on the map they created, you see just down there in the bottom left, old Spanish fields, not by Spaniards, but by people living in the Spanish period Florida. This isn't much. It only hints at a location, hints at what we now know is an impressive history. under the guidance of Vicky Oldham and Looking for Angola, the research team started trying to figure out what to do. There were some hints at the Tabby House ruins, as Sherry Robinson Spekas pointed out and pointed towards. There was a good sense that the Braden Castle may offer some hints for the location. In the neighborhood of the Manatee Mineral Spring, someone had found this wonderful bayonet. We were able to do some underwater archaeology under Dr. J. Kazi. And what you can see on the map is these are just little dots in what is, as you can tell from the topo map, a highly urbanized area. We were looking for something that was built by people who didn't want to be found in a place that had been transformed greatly. The only reason we were able to actually find something was the work of Sherry Spekas. After being an undergraduate at New College of Florida, working on a thesis that looked at the materials from the Tabby House ruins at DeSoto National Memorial, Sherry decided it was a good idea to share this set of insights in a public venue and got funding from the Florida Humanities Council for a program that we titled Traces of Our Past. Well, I'll continue that story in a moment. Because of some of this work, New College of Florida was able to get funding to create the Public Archaeology Lab in 2008. And really the reason the lab exists and functions more than just the shell was the really amazing managerial skills that Sherry brought to the task of the budgeting and the procurement of equipment and helping programming. When we did excavations in 2008, 2009, 2013, Sherry was always there being field director and managing all of the materials. When it was time to put in a National Park Service application, Sherry was there. And in the project I'll be talking about in just a few minutes, she was the field director and lab supervisor. Part of what happened, and again, the slender reed image, we went, I gave a talk, Cantor Brown Jr. gave a talk, Margot Schradron gave a talk with the National Park Service. And after we've all finished, Trudy and Jeff Williams came up to us and said, if you're interested in this history, why don't you come to the Manatee Mineral Spring, where we've been trying to do some research. And we took them up on that offer. And it was just amazing. I'd heard about this organization, but I hadn't interacted with it. In 1997, Trudy and Jeff Williams created Reflections of Manatee to help preserve the history by the Manatee Mineral Spring. If they hadn't, it would all have been built over and gone. But their actions, and particularly when Sherry joined the organization as VP, made sure that, as I put on the bottom, we now have this steadfast tree that built from this very slender reed. For some of the history of these 15 years, again, just to recap it before we get to the actual excavations, we kicked off the events with public lectures. In 2005, we did a series of small-scale excavations. I produced a report showing that there was material traces of Angola by the Manatee Mineral Spring in 2014. We worked on creating interpretive signs with the help of Ed and Diana Gonzalez-Tennant. We produced digital reconstructions. There was a festival, I'll mention again, back to Angola, and then the Park Service acknowledgements. So this was part of the Network to Freedom, the Underground Railroad in 2019. Here you can just see some of the work that we did. 2007 was remote sensing, 2008 excavations, 2009. The little green squares, that's what we did. It was just a little view of it, but that was enough for the Bradenton Herald to say, yep, we discovered those remnants. And it was enough for the National Underground Railroad, the Network to Freedom, to acknowledge that, yes, we had found part of that place of freedom when people escaped from enslavement, self-liberated themselves, got to the Manatee River. Well, this caused a lot of excitement in Bradenton. It got tremendous media attention, the local newspaper, local news, and in early 2019, there was announced plans for the extension of Riverwalk. That entertainment district has been wildly successful. And the plan was to bring it all the way to the Manatee Mineral Spring. and have it be the eastern terminal. As you can see in the diagram, they were going to just take this small park and create a pond, create lagoons, new pathways, really transform what's now an empty field into something new. And my response, panic. If they're going to do all that work, what would happen to the archaeological remains that I left underground? I'd purposely done just small scale excavations to not get overwhelmed with the amount of materials that were potentially there. What would happen? We organized, and again, Sifters was just so helpful with it. And I just laid it out as saving Angola, that this was the chance to save it. In the most recent issue of Adventures in Florida Archaeology, you'll see this cover story, community-based archaeology as grassroots activism. That this was a chance to use all that positive work we had done, all those allies and friends and supporters, and bring it to bear. And it worked. The city of Bradenton funded the excavations in January 2020. The Division of Historical Resources funded lab work from August through January of this year. And now I get to share with you that history that we have and some of the materials that we have come across. This is just a whole series of images, both from the excavations and from the lab work. For those who haven't heard me speak about Angola, haven't read some of those newsletter or other articles, here's just some dates to keep in mind as we go through the material. As hopefully most of you know, Spain claimed La Florida in 1513. Spanish rule lasted until 1763, when the British took over for 20 years. After the American Revolution, Florida reverted back to Spain in what's known as the Second Spanish Period. 1821 is when the United States gains Florida, and 1845 Florida gains statehood. This history is not static. The map shows this movement of people from Prospect Bluff to Swanee to Angola, and then ultimately to the Bahamas. The key dates: 1693, 1814, 1818, and 1821 for you all. And I'll note that as we were making sense of this history, and this last 15 years has been part of work that many others have joined in on, trying to say, what were these freedom-seeking people doing? What was the history that was here? There were fragments available, but they hadn't been put together. That old cliche about archaeology as having only a few dozen pieces from a 100-piece puzzle couldn't be more true. We were trying to figure out where to put the pieces and what pieces went together, and all times thinking about who were these people who were so courageous and determined to live a life of freedom that they took the chance to go deep into the peninsula. And I've often been inspired by the Black feminist thought of Audre Lorde. The master's tools will never dismantle the master's house. The only way to fight slavery was to escape slavery. And what we have in Florida are those people who saw flight from slavery as resistance to it. And in many ways, they were right, even though it took more generations to reach that goal. We start this history with Florida as a haven of freedom by St. Augustine at a place called Fort Muse. It wasn't extant for very long. As the Spanish king, Charles II, proclaimed that anyone who escaped enslavement in the English colonies, who came to St. Augustine, if they accepted Spanish rule and Catholicism, they could live as free people. And they came. They came through really difficult endeavors, and they came in large enough numbers that the governor of St. Augustine created a new community for them just north of St. Augustine. You can see it here in the map on the bottom left. They existed only for 2 years at first before it was destroyed by Anglo and British soldiers, and then again for 11 years. Before we did this project, if I can turn back to the early 21st century, it seemed like that was kind of the story of Black freedom, was Fort Muse. But there was another history as well in the Panhandle. During the War of 1812, which of course was part of a much larger set of battles across Europe and elsewhere, Edward Nichols, a British soldier, officer, organized Native Americans and free blacks on the Apalachicola River at a place called Prospect Bluff. And he and the other British engineers created a fort. And we have, thanks to a book, and you see the title there, by Nathaniel Millett, the speech that Edward Nichols gave, where he promised these people that the lands will be given to you in the British colonies, where you can cultivate them and your children will never have to go through the misery of enslavement or being torn apart. You will be able to live in freedom if you join the British in the fight for freedom. And they did. In the hundreds, they did. And this fort was large, significant, and sadly, in July 1816, after the Battle of New Orleans, U.S. Navy ships went into Spanish territory up the Apalachicola River. As the American sailors reported, a lucky shot hit the magazine, destroyed it, blew up the fort. Hundreds were killed, many more wounded, some were captured. And it seemed that was the end of the story. This is a reconstruction, what we think the fort looked like, with both the Union Jack and the red flag, showing this was a place that was fighting for its freedom. In its time, this was well known, but it was almost quickly forgotten and almost erased from history. We follow the people, though, who were not killed, the ones who were not captured. They went to Swanee, the Swanee River, where Billy Bowlegs, the great Seminole leader, had a village known as Bowlegs Town, and he let them settle in what is noted on this US military map as the little hamlets, little dots, where they again built their homes, plowed their fields, had their horses and cows, until Andrew Jackson came down with his Tennessee Volunteers in 1818 and attacked the Swanee community, destroying it. But as the US military records stated very clearly, the Black warriors held off the US troops so that everyone escaped, and they escaped southward. 15 years ago, we thought they might have gone south, but really no one had been writing about it. It just seemed like that was the end of the story. We did have hints from one of Andrew Jackson's aides, James Gladson, that Tampa Bay was the last rallying spot for these African Americans and Native Americans. And this is where they were able to have communications with Spanish and English emissaries. But as I pointed out, this is a large area. We have from John Lee Williams, just again, this little hint in 1837 that there was a place where the Braden River meets the Manatee, where these British supporters of the Maroons, as I'll be referring to them, these people who are living in freedom, had set up agricultural fields. And so we looked and we studied and we examined and we tried to make sense of what was here. When we had that opportunity in January 2020, we were able to build on all that work in order to reveal what was there. Here you can just see some of the images from the excavations. And what we've been doing is trying to piece this together. And similar to every step along the way, particularly when I talk with time sifters, we're not done yet, right? I want to make this really abundantly clear. You all are getting the first views of this. And I'm doing it, one, because you have committed so much of yourselves. So many of the people on this Zoom call have volunteered your time, have given support in so many different ways. And I'm hoping you all can help us make sense of it, because it is fragmentary. It is something to pull together. We have a lot of folks working on this, and I want to bring you all in as well to make sense of it. We were able to excavate a tremendous amount of dirt. This is a drone shot to courtesy of Kimberly Horn that gives you a little bit of a sense when you look down and see the buckets and the shovels, how much of an area that we were able to excavate in that 4-week period. You should be able to see that in the middle, we have our datum, which we use to keep track of all the excavation units. I'll tell you about some of the little pieces of this. For those who love archaeology and love stratigraphy, one of our crew members was able to give us this really nice drawing. What we have for the Angola history is an ephemeral level. It's a tremendous amount of information, but I want to make it really clear. It's a very thin level. They were not here very long, and they didn't want to be found. This is the ground surface. Let's see the grass and the two individuals on top. A layer of basically early 21st century and 20th century materials. Materials from the late 19th century, materials from the village of Manatee, founded in 1840s, and then continued on to the present. And it's in these little dark spots, intermediate, not continuous at all in this sketch, that we've been finding and found materials that date to the Angola period. So of the 35,000 objects that we recovered, the majority of them belong to the village of Manatee and its successor settlements. I'll be looking today and sharing with you today just some of the pieces from those earlier, that Angola level. Here you can see just another aerial. We also excavate just to the top of this, you would find the Manatee River. Seems like there was a lot of change in this part of the property, which we refer to as the Powell's property. And I do just want to note again, because one of my themes for today has been how lucky we are, how just having a few people committed made a difference. As you can tell, there's a fence here. We were able to cover a little bit of information here. There wasn't a small scale excavation done before the construction, but tremendous amounts of information probably were lost on the other side of that fence. And I think that's worth knowing. The only way preservation occurs in the United States, in Florida, in Manatee or Sarasota, is because people care and care and care and demand that the work gets done. We were so lucky that we had that sort of support here. I'll note that one of the board members was tremendously helpful. Laura Harrison created a 3D model for the entire excavation. And I kind of like this image, the amount of material she has. I've been looking at, I've been using as I've been going through it. She's going to keep me really busy with all that she produced. What I like about this particular image is that ghostly feel of it, that the 3D scanning lets me right now, and this is something that's kind of an offer for anyone who's interested, measure where things are. That high quality digital materials are quite usable as an exact photographic 3D replica of the excavations. So when I need to measure some of the excavation units again to check, I just went to this 3D model and was able to get there. So the excavations are not done. They're buried at this point. If you go up there to East Bradenton, you won't see any open excavation units, but they live on digitally thanks to the work of Access 3D Lab. Well, I'm not going to share everything we found because I want to not take up your whole evening, but I do want to mention some of the pieces that may be associated with the Angola community. One of the more maybe not surprising components of this excavation was because there were so many people after the Angola community that when the village of Manatee was created, there was just constant people to the present. And so although the interest in the early 19th century was a place that was very much full of hammocks and trees and mucky waters, by the time we get to the 1840s, it's urban archaeology and with all the complexities of urban archaeology. But somehow what you see there survived. And what hopefully you can see and tell is as we came across this wooden box that had some wood and other rubble on top of it. When it was cleared out, and this photo is by Sherry Svekis, and she deserves credit for it. It's just a brilliant photo. What you see here is the reflection of one of the excavators, Johnny, in the barrel well. And a barrel well is exactly what it sounds like. They dug the hole, they took a barrel, took off the top and bottom, put it in the ground, put some kind of support around it. If you look closely, you can see this dark stain. There are probably two posts and maybe something on top of the post to bring the bucket up and down. And what was really remarkable is as we were digging out the dirt, as we were removing the mucky waters, fresh water flowed upward. And it was really quite remarkable that what has been there for a couple of centuries still lasts. From its location, from the stratigraphic context, it seems like it's connected with the Angola community. There was what I can only describe as a big hunk of metal that was right on top of it. And through just some wonderful luck, a piece of ceramic was embedded in that. It's now at the Bureau of Archaeological Research up in Tallahassee, where it's being conserved. And we're quite hopeful that they'll be able to tell us something about the ceramic and the metal that will help us confirm the date. What we have not been able to figure out, and this is where very much ideas are always worthwhile to share, we know there's a mineral spring here. We know people were drinking from that mineral spring. We know there were Native Americans here in the pre-Columbian times because of the spring. We know one of the reasons the maroons came was because of the spring. We know the Anglo-Americans came because of the spring. We know the spring was used over the generations until it was capped in the late 20th century. Why, if there's a spring, would you dig a well? And we're still a little puzzled by that, although it may be that the mineral content of the spring was different, or maybe they just wanted to have a different location for a different source of water than the spring itself. But it's a wonderful find. We have this photograph, video drawn in every direction and still intact under the ground. And as they do the work at creating the park, they promised us this particular spot will be protected, so it will always be there for a future study. One of the other things we came across that I really am excited to share, and again, all this is initial, and I'm sharing not the final conclusions, that kind of old archaeology or sit in the lab, get it all done and then share with you all. That's going to take a few more years. I think you have the right to know what we're doing now. As we're excavating down, again, at that level, we're finding ceramics and other diagnostic materials from the early 19th century, from the Angola period. We're finding post molds. Post molds are exactly what they sound like. You put a post in the ground for a structure. When that post is removed or burnt or otherwise dissolves, there's a stain left in the ground. As you excavate down, it's a perfect circle. You excavate down through it, you find a little point at the bottom. Well, in that same level, we were finding 4 post molds, and I asked 3 of the crew to join me, and we're standing on the 4 post molds, and it seems like it makes a nice little structure. We thought that was interesting. That area in the middle, we kept on excavating, again, carefully going through the levels, through what is not visible to you all, but I can recall being the late 19th, mid 19th century, getting down. And then we found 2 small pits. And thanks to Rosin Howard, again, who has worked with the descendant community in Red Bays, has been in conversation with them. We found these 2 objects that you see right on the screen. One on the left, if it looks like half a projectile point to you, well, that's what we think it looks like as well. It's made out of glass, just regular glass, lead glass, a kind of typical glass of the 19th century. We do know that across Florida in the 19th century, Seminole people took mass-produced glass and made tools out of them. Instead of making tools out of stone, they made it out of glass. And this one looks like a half projectile point. In the other pit, we found, and so far we're still referring to this as the G-shaped object. It may be an ornament. It may be something to hold a cloak together. We're not quite sure. What Professor Howard has been looking at and is contributing to the report is the assumption that the people who built this structure dug those two small holes, put these down in some kind of, and this is what archaeologists always say, ritual behavior, right? That we don't know what that ritual is. We don't know what the belief system was. And at this point, I'm not ready to take any even public guesses. But we have a hint of people's lives, which is always what archaeology wants to give us, right? That you always want to have a sense that this was scary. People were living on the Manatee River. They had gone through the battles at Prospect Bluff, the Battle of Swanee. They knew there were people coming after them. Florida, this part of Florida was a dangerous, difficult place to be in so many different ways. And maybe for good luck, for belief, for faith, they put two small objects in separate pits in the ground to help protect them or to remember them. And then when the destruction finally happened, it was left in the ground to wait for January 2020 to be revealed. There's a lot more we want to do to try to figure out what this part of their lives were like. Much of the work we did, of course, was in the lab. And again, we had volunteers from Sifters come, both inside and outside the building during this pandemic to do that work. And one of the things we're able to do in the lab was clean things. We had found not just wood for that well, but a good deal of wood in various places, preserved sometimes from that bottom level, from that level from Angola. And when this piece of wood was cleaned out, the student was really kind of excited. I think they're still excited that you can see that it's clearly an architectural feature, that it easily could imagine that it was put together to make a cabin. And we have other pieces that we're preserving and trying to make sense of, and maybe we'll have a sense of what these buildings look like from these. Two more members of your board have been very busy at work at the lab, doing all of that work. And you can see Jean and Mary in the corner. We have ceramics, thousands of pieces of ceramics. We've only been able at this point to count, weigh, and identify them. And what we've found, and really June Lambie is the key in this, that from all the ceramics that we have, there seems to be two nodes of dates. One from basically the 1770s to 1820, i.e. The Angola period, and then 1840s and later, the village of Manatee and beyond. So we actually have in the ceramic, diagnostic ceramics, some of that evidence. One of the things we realized from the previous excavations, and it took a little while to make sense of it, we see in the bottom a British mass-produced ceramics. It was so easy to just assume that people of African heritage living in the really wilds of Florida would somehow be outside of history. But what the archaeology has shown all too well is not at all. They were tied into the British world system. They traded with the British merchants and got other goods from British officers like Edward Nichols. And so they had been promised they could live in British lands as British subjects, and their material culture was British, particularly the dishes, the household items. We did find, you can see it was found in 3 pieces and associated with the Barrow Well, one earthen-made structure, pot. And it's actually interesting that we only found one out of all the things that we had. And as you can tell from this image, it's fairly large. And so we're also going to try to make sense of that piece of the story, as well as go through all these materials to have a sense of what were the things that were available that they wanted to have in their lives. And I've always been had quite an affection to this pearlware that you see there, tinted blue. I mentioned before that projectile point. We found a goodly number of glass that was shown to be flaked. And for those who've looked at flaking on flint, on rock, you can see it has the same characteristics on this glass. When you do this to glass, it becomes a really good cutting edge. And so we assume it had those kind of 2 uses. We've made an initial look through at them, and there's going to be much more work to be done, including some ethnoarchaeology, to see how if we can reproduce the sort of markings that we have on these types of belongings. Thanks to Diane Wallman of the University of South Florida, Tampa, we have identification of the bones that we recovered. I'll stress here, as I've stressed several times, no human remains were found. None were expected. This was a place where people lived, and no human remains were found. But a lot of bones were found, and Dr. Wallman has just been tremendously helpful in laying out what these are, the almost 5,000 different species that she's been able to identify, everything from squirrels to wild boar to chickens and cows, domestic chicken and cows, a burial of a possum. We know from the cup bones they were butchering a cow and eating it, as well as other animals. We have and starting to build an image of what animals were around, both the domesticated animals and the wild animals that came onto the places where the people were. But then came this really exciting find, and again, from the Angola level. And you can see what I've circled is this rectangle. And this rectangle is the remains of a rectangular box, wooden box. The wood itself had dissolved. The soil is quite wet. It's not surprising. And thanks to Professor Wallman, we know that this box had a full dog burial, a purposeful burial. It was about 16 to 18 inches high, a little less than 50 pounds in weight. The analogy she gave was either it's the size of a border collie or an Australian shepherd. This is an image of a Carolina dog. We want to make sense of people's lives. And so we're not using the old terms of runaway slaves or even the more kind of relevant self-emancipated people of African heritage. We talk about maroons, we talk about the ancestors of Black Seminoles, but for me, for others, it's so easy to imagine someone having a dog who was with them, who probably was helpful in so many ways as well as loving. And when the dog died, being put in a box and buried for 200 years until we were able to retrieve it and be able to tell that part of this really incredible story for the people and the animals of Angola. Not surprising, we're right by the Manatee River. Lots and lots of shell, fish bones, ortholites, the bones from the ears of fish. We have a lot more work to do in making sense of it, and this is really thanks to one of the excavators who's a descendant from the people of Angola. Jason was just clear in finding some shell from crabs, as well as, of course, the oysters and all the fish bones. And we found piles of those oyster shells with the crab shell bones, fish bone. And so we have a sense, yes, they butchered cow and ate that. They probably ate other meats as well. They probably gathered. We know they had crops, and they used these marine resources. And as we look more closely at the concentrations of materials, maybe we'll be able to see some episodes of history of when people got together and had a feast at this location 200 years ago. We have thousands of items of these belongings. Some are recognizable. You see there, sorry, the way the image ends up looking with the fingers being lost, but a clay tobacco pipe, right? Pretty straightforward. Like many of the people in that era, smoking tobacco, a way to get through the days. And these clay tobacco pipes were part of the British mass-produced wares. They broke, they were thrown into the ground. We have that piece of it. And on the other side of the screen, sometimes we don't know what things are. Found through a few of the layers were these thin metal strings with hooks, with loops, and sometimes with weights. We're assuming that they were fishing nets. We don't know what era they were from. We don't have any analogies. One of my professors, when I was a young graduate student on excavation, said, and I still remember Dr. Baram saying it, archaeologists always want to find something new and exciting and unknown. And then when they find it, they don't know what it is. Well, this is one of those things. We don't know what it is, but we'll continue to work. We'll ask for people to give input, and maybe we'll figure out what this was and then what era it was from. We're able, and I'm going to start wrapping up, to know that those initial inferences from the small-scale excavations were actually correct. That the maroons, these freedom-seeking people on the Manatee River, used British mass-produced goods. That's the majority of what they used. Only if that one big fragmented vessel, pottery vessel, we see Seminole-style glass flaking. And of course, that could mean so many things. I've always stressed we need to keep identities fluid. These were not reified identities. They were not this or that or something else. They were trying to live in freedom, and they're trying to ensure that children could live in freedom. That was their focus. Some we refer to as maroons, ultimately Black Seminoles. Some we call Seminoles and Miccosukee. All kinds of social relations among people, but I can refer to as the Seminole style glass flaking. We know, and this is previous work I've done, a robust agricultural community. We know of the pumpkins and maize and beans and herbs that they grew in their fields. We know of their livestock, the cows and horses that they had, as well as from this excavation, the chickens and other animals, and the pets they had, because the dog is obviously a pet. And we always keep in mind that this is where I did the excavations, led the excavations, and this was a key presence, but there also was a presence in what's now under the Braden Castle, and there were hamlets, small agricultural families, farms, all the way down to Sarasota Bay, probably all the way down to where New College and the Ringling Museum of Art are today. That it wasn't just in this one place. This is just the one place that has been preserved, and we're able to do the excavations. This was a much, much larger community. And again, thanks to Digital Heritage Interactive, this is what we think it looked like. The spring brought water down to the Manatee River, and most likely people threw stuff in there, and it settled down, and we can actually tell some of the stratigraphic components from that. You saw some of the wood. We assumed it was wooden cabins that they had. That's what was reported was destroyed. And you see some of the crops in the foreground here. In the far right of my screen is what was a pre-Columbian mound that was there until the 1930s. And it really has held up quite well. But unlike that first round where we just kind of could say, yes, Angola was here. Yes, we have some material traces. Now we have the start of the everyday lives of these maroons, the ways they're able to create a new way of life for themselves, not the life they had in enslavement, but the life they wanted to lead here in freedom in what's now Manatee County. Of course, as some of you know this well, and I hinted at it before, it did end. And thanks to Cantor Brown Jr., who found this newspaper report in the Charlotte City Gazette, we know that in the end of April of 1821, 200 years ago, some men of wealth and influence wanted to steal what they thought was property, right? This is the notions, the racist notions of the slavery era, that this was just available labor that they could take. And they organized a campaign, a slave raid. And as it says here, they arrived at Sarasota, which was the other name for this community. We stayed with Angola, and captured about 300 of them, plundered their plantations. Plantation just means fields. It's just a changing of the language over the last 200 years. Set fires to their houses, right? Not huts, not anything simple, but houses, and then went further all the way down to Charlotte Harbor. And I've always been chilled by these words in this newspaper account. The terror thus spread among the western coast of East Florida, broke all the establishments of both Blacks and Indians who fled. But this wasn't the end. Thanks to the work of Ross and Howard, we know that Some escaped to this interior Florida, but others escaped to the British Bahamas. They had been promised at Prospect Bluff in the Panhandle that if they fought with the British, they could live in freedom in the British lands. And Bahamas, until 1973, was a British colony. And one of the things Rosin Howard was able to find, and here you see it laid out, we know the names of some of the people who were captured and taken up into enslavement. But we also know that two of them, you can see it there with my blue arrows, they ran away. So they were captured, but they ran away. There was a listing of names of people who got to Red Bays and Andros Island in 1828, saying these people have been here for 7 years. Although it's harder to read in this handwriting than to type notes, these are the same names. We know two of the people who were captured and got to the Bahamas. And so the others were never captured and got there. I went, Rosin Howard had worked, Ricky Oldham had worked with the elders, Ms. Marshall, who you see in the bottom, Reverend Newton, who had been holding on to the history. As I started this presentation with, they knew the ancestors had come from Florida. They had created a life for themselves in Andros Island. They had lived in freedom for generations. We were able to share with them and their children and their grandchildren that the ancestors had come from the Manatee River. That's where they launched their campaign for freedom. And when the community was destroyed, that's where they ended up going to Cape Florida and across the Florida Straits to the Bahamas. This history really came together thanks to Daphne Towns, a Bradenton resident who one day was walking by Manatee Mineral Spring Park and noticed the heritage interpretation signs we had put up. And as she recounted, her husband noted, hey, it says something about Andros Island, where you come from. And she read it. She contacted Trudy Williams, who contacted Vicky Oldham and myself. And in what I can only describe as just another one of these miracles, she organized in 2018 the Back to Angola Festival, and she did again in 2019. And she brought her family members and her neighbors from Red Bays to have a celebration of food and dance and music on the very ground where their ancestors had found freedom 200 years before. The festival was in 2018, it was in 2019, of course in 2020 we couldn't hold it with the pandemic, but the hope is that we'll have this be an annual event. We're able, with this energy from all these people who've contributed to this work, a sense that we've gone from legend to history. I can give exact dates, I can name individuals, I can tell you where things happened. And we go from those objects to the people. These are some of the names of the people we know were at Angola. And in that expression that has now become really significant, we can say their names. We can talk about Hector and Queen and Bob and Louis and Manuel and Charles and Cyrus and Nancy. And because we've gotten this piece of the history together now with the sense of people's lives from the archaeology, we can fill in the biographies for some of the famous Black Seminoles of the Second Seminole War and later. Abraham, probably the most famous of the people during the Second Seminole War, who helped negotiate in Washington, D.C. during the war. He may have been at Angola. John Horse, who went on the Trail of Tears to Indian Territory, to Oklahoma, led an outbreak so people could live in freedom. And Louis, born in enslavement in St. Augustine, may well have lived in Angola, became famous for his survival of the Dade Massacre that led to the Second Seminole War, and lived out his life until 1895, and before his death was able to tell his story to the Florida Times-Union. These are people we can imagine petted that dog, ate the beef, ate the shellfish, stayed in those buildings that we have been able to reconstruct. And I'll go on to just say, one of the most wonderful moments of doing this work was having one of the descendants who was raised in Florida, trained as an archaeologist, Jason Brown. When we were doing the excavations, he was interviewed by the WWSB, the local ABC station, And he was quoted as saying, it's that very emotional feeling to know that you're walking the ground and then knowing the historical circumstances in which his ancestors desired to be free and that he was able to live in freedom because they desired to be free. And the story that Cantor Brown has always told us is a story of freedom really resonates because of that personal aspect, that very human part of this history. Vicky Oldham has taken to talking about the spirit of Angola, that sense that brings people there for the Back to Angola Festival, the Network to Freedom designation that sees as part of that large-scale civil rights movement known as the Underground Railroad, how Riverwalk, I didn't need to panic, I guess, maybe I did, was able to celebrate this history and will respect it. More festivals, the excavations, the lab work, and at Reflections of Manatee as Curry House, a beautiful exhibit showing the stratigraphy, laying out the heritage that's beneath your feet, that people will be able to visit, see, learn, and hopefully accelerate our knowledge about the people who lived in what is now just a stratigraphic layer deep underground. The image I've given for this community-based archaeology over the last years is to imagine this as like ripples in a pond. We've done so much thanks to Time Sifters and others, right? I've done the reports, I've done the conference papers, I've written articles, I've also written essays as have others. There's been documentaries made, including most recently Finding for Angola. There's been media accounts seemingly without end. James Hawkins wrote a song, Freedom, Looking for Angola. We have Melanie Lavender doing spoken word poetry. We have video games from the ranchos. At the bottom, you see my kids in their young age. We did tremendous amounts of kids programming and had materials for the schools. We have the heritage interpretation signs. You see the one for Angola on the screen. We've given tours. Visit Florida has a page for finding African-American history and Florida's Angola community, so tourists can come. And frankly, it's not enough. We want to do more and more, and so much looking forward. There are so many people I need to thank to allow me to be the avenue to do this research and to help disseminate the findings and the finds from it, that it would have taken my entire time if I'd laid all those people out by name. But I do want to end with the way I started. None of this would have happened if Time Sifters hadn't provided that support time and time again in so many different ways. So a very big thank you for the support of Time Sifters Archaeology Society for this. And as we think about this part of the history, this really fantastic history for Angola, it's only one of the slices at Manatee Mineral Springs. And thanks to a grant from Florida Humanities, Time Sifters is sponsoring a website. And this comes out of my thinking, and I'll take full blame and credit. I had Charles Ringling be a tour guide to the archaeology of Sarasota and Manatee. As you can see on this, we're not quite ready to share it, but it is live if you want to go to this website and see a bit about the Paleo-Indian period, the Archaic, the Minnesota, the Spanish period, the Cuban Rancho period, the Angola period, of course, Seminoles, the plantations, the Whitakers when we get to Sarasota, and the Scots, Newtown, and then the Ringlings, and even more. So I hope as I've gone through this, you know that there's even more we need to know, that we have to be always vigilant to help preserve this so we can learn even more about the past that's beneath our feet. And I'll just say again, thanks to you, Time Sifters, and thank you all to listening to my presentation.